In this video, we're going to go through an in-depth example of calculating the Bonzoff power indices for this given weighted voting system. So in this weighted voting system, we see that there are four players. Player 1, Player 2, Player 3, and Player 4, where Player 1 has 8 votes, Player 2 has 4 votes, Player 3 has 2 votes, and Player 4 has 1 vote. And in this case, we see that the quota is 10. So anytime there is a motion up for vote, in order for the motion to pass, a coalition must have 10 or more votes to get that motion passed. So in order to calculate the Bonzoff power indices for each of the players, the very first thing we're going to need to do is determine all of the winning coalitions. First, we can ask, what about one player winning coalitions? So what about one player? If there was a one player winning coalition, that would be a dictator. That player would have to have, their number of votes would have to meet the quota or be beyond that, and we can see that doesn't happen. Nobody has 10 or more votes. So no one player winning coalitions. So what about two player? Right, so there's only so many possibilities for two-player coalitions. So we could have 1, 2, namely Player 1 and Player 2. We could have 1, 3, namely Player 1 and Player 3, and 1, 4. Right, so right now I'm just listing all coalitions that are two-player, not just the winning ones. And then we could have 2, 3 and 2, 4, and then we could have 3. So those are all the possibilities for two-player coalitions. Now, which of them are winning? If we look at 1, 2, for that coalition, how many votes does that coalition control? Well, Player 1 has 8 votes, Player 2 has 4 votes, so altogether that coalition has 12 votes, which meets the quota. So that's a winning coalition. What about 1, 3? Well, that would be 8 plus 2, which is 10, and that meets the quota. 1, 4, well, that would be 8 plus 1 votes. That does not meet the quota. That would only be 9, but the quota is 10, so that's not a winning coalition. What about 2, 3? Well, that would be 4 plus 2, or 6, so that doesn't meet it. 2, 4, that would be 4 plus 1, or 5. That doesn't meet the quota. And 3 plus 4 would be 2 plus 1, which is 3. So we only have two-player winning coalitions. What about three-player coalitions? So again, let's list all the coalitions and then look at and see which ones are actually winning. So how many possibilities do we have? Well, we have 4 players, so we can just kind of go through. Well, one possibility is we go 1, 2, 3, or we could do 1, 2, 4. We could do 1, 3, 4. So these are all the these are all the coalitions which have Player 1 in them, with 3 players. We only have 4 players, and so if we're going to have a 3-player coalition that contains Player 1, then somebody has to be out of it. So the only possibilities are Player 4 is out of it, Player 3 is out of it, or Player 2 is out of it. And now we can go on and say, what about those that do not contain 1? Well, there's only one possibility, 2, 3, 4. So those are all the 3-player coalitions. Now the question is, which of those are winning coalitions? So now looking up values. So 1, 2, 3, that's definitely winning because that would be 8 plus 4 plus 2. That exceeds 10. 1, 2, 4, again, because it would be 8 plus 4 plus 1, so that exceeds 10. 1, 3, 4, that would be 8 plus 2 plus 1, so that would exceed 10. And 2, 3, 4, well, that would be 4 plus 2 plus 1, so that would be 7. That does not exceed the quota. And finally, we have one more possibility, right? We could have the grand coalition with all 4 players. And this is no possibilities here, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, clearly that's a winning coalition. If everybody votes the same way, it's going to go. So now we have our lists of all our winning coalitions, right? So now let's write them again. So our winning coalitions, we had no one-player coalitions that won. For two-player, we had 1, 2, and 1, 3. For 3-player, we had 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, and 1, 3, 4. And then for 4-player, we had the Grand Coalition with 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we have all the winning coalitions. We need to determine in each of these coalitions who are the critical players. Remember that the definition of a critical player is the following. Look at a given player in a winning coalition. We're trying to find out, are they critical? Throw them out of the coalition. Look at the remaining people in the coalition, the remaining players, and look at the number of votes they control altogether. Either that those number of votes meets the quota or it doesn't. If it meets the quota, what that means is you could kick out the player and the remaining players could still meet the quota, so they didn't need the player that got kicked out. So that player that got kicked out is not critical to that winning coalition. On the other hand, if you kick the player out and the remaining players do not meet the quota, then that means that in order to be a winning coalition, they have to have that player. So that's what it means to be critical. So let's go through and see in this first coalition, 1, 2, who's critical. So we want to ask, is player 1 critical in that coalition, 1, 2? Or remember, well actually, let's write down the voting system here again so we can reference it. So 10 was the quota, we had 8, 4, 2, 1. So 1, 2. So suppose we kick player 1 out. Well, then the only person left is player 2, and they only control 4 votes. So clearly, they went from winning to non-winning. So player 1 is needed. If you take that coalition 1, 2 and kick player 1 out, the resulting coalition is no longer a winning coalition, so player 1 is critical. So we will underline player 1. Now what about player 2? Well, if we kicked player 2 out, the only person left would be player 1. Player 1 only controls 8 votes, which does not meet the quota, so player 2 is also critical. What about 1 and 3? Well, clearly, if we kick 1 out, player 1 has 8 votes, player 3 is only 2 votes, so clearly 1 is critical. And what about 3? Well, we've already seen player 1 has only 8 votes, so player 1 needs player 3 in order to have a winning coalition, so 3 is also critical. Now what about 1, 2, 3? Well, suppose we kick player 1 out. The remaining players are players 2 and player 3. Together, they would control 6 votes, which is not enough, so player 1 is definitely critical. Now suppose we kick player 2 out. Now notice, we've kicked player 2 out, 1 and 3 are still in the coalition. Player 1 has 8 votes, player 3 has 2 votes, so they meet the quota. So they're still a winning coalition even if we kick out 2. So 2 is not critical, so we do not underline 2. Now, we can ask the same thing as 3 critical, but we can actually make this a little bit simpler on ourselves. Once we stop underlining, once we have somebody that's not critical and we don't underline them, then nobody else after them can be underlined. The reason for this is the way that we listed our players. We listed them from the highest weight to the lowest weight, right? Player 1 is 8 votes, player 2 is 4 votes, player 3 is 2 votes, player 4 is 1 vote. They're listed in the order of the number of votes they control. So if 2 is not critical, that means you can kick 2 out and you still have enough votes to meet the quota. Then if you kick 3 out, 1 and 2 are going to have even more votes than 1 and 3 did. So if 2 wasn't critical, then 3 can't possibly be critical. So we do not underline 3. Now what about the coalition 1, 2, 4? Looking at the votes, if you kick 1 out, 2 has 4 votes, 4 has only 1, so you definitely need 1. They're critical. If we kick player 2 out, 1 and 4 together only have 9 votes. Close, but it does not meet the quota. So 2 is still needed, so 2 is critical. If we kick 4 out, 1 and 2 together control 12 votes, which passes the quota. 4 is not needed to be winning, so we do not underline 4. Now, what about this coalition consisting of players 1, players 3, and player 4? Well, you can check that if we kick player 1 out, player 3 and player 4 only control 3 votes, so 1 is definitely critical. If we kick out player 3, then 1 and 4 only control 9 votes, which is not enough, so 3 is definitely critical. And finally, if we kick out 4, 1 and 3 together control 10 votes, which meets the quota, so 4 is not needed, so we do not underline 4. And finally, for the Grand Coalition, consisting of players 1, player 2, player 3, and player 4, if we kick out 1, then players 2, 3, and 4 would only control 7 votes, 4 plus 2 plus 1, which is not enough, so player 1 is critical. If we kick out player 2, then player 1 and 3 and 4 would control 11 votes. Meets the quota, so player 2 is not critical. As soon as player 2 is not underlined, then we know that 3 can't be underlined and 4 can't be underlined. So we're done. So for every single winning coalition, we have identified which players are critical. The next step is we have to calculate these numbers that we call B sub I. So we need to calculate B1, B2, B3, and B4. And these numbers are just, all these numbers are, is how many times is that player critical. So B1 is just how many times is player 1 critical, or in other words, how many times is player 1 underlined. Well, if we look through these 6 coalitions here are our only winning coalitions, so we just count how many times 1 has been underlined. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So B1, which is the number of times that player 1 is critical, is 6. What about player 2? How many times is player 2 critical in a winning coalition? Well, how many times is player 2 underlined? 1, 2, and that's it. Only twice. What about player 3? How many times are they underlined? Well, there's 1, 2, and again that's it. So also for player 3, they're only critical twice. And what about player 4? How many times is player 4 underlined? Well, if we look in each of these coalitions, we see that 4 is never underlined. So that means the number of times they're critical is 0. We form this number we call T, and what this is the number of time any player is critical. So namely, this is just B1 plus B2 plus B3 plus B4. It's the number of times that any player is critical. So you take the number of times that player 1 is critical, plus the number of times that player 2 is critical, plus the number of times that player 3 is critical, plus the number of times that player 4 is critical. So this would give us 6 plus 2 plus 2 plus 0, and that would be 10, 6 plus 4. Now, we can finally calculate the Bonds-off power indices, which we denote by beta sub I. So we need to figure out what is beta sub 1, beta sub 2, beta sub 3, and beta sub 4. And the way that we calculate the Bonds-off power index, it's the number of times player I is critical divided by the number of times any player is critical. Beta sub I is just B sub I over T. B sub I is the number of times that player I is critical, and the T is the number of times any player is critical. So we just have to calculate that for each one of the 4 players. So beta sub 1 right here would be what? Well, we take B1 over T, so that would be 6 over 10. Beta sub 2, it would be 2 over 10. Beta sub 3 would be also 2 over 10. And finally, beta sub 4 would be 0 over 10. So simplifying these a little bit, we'd see that beta sub 1, which was 6 over 10, we can put this fraction into simpler form by dividing by 2 on top and bottom, and we would get 3/5. Beta sub 2 and beta sub 3 are equal to one another, and they're just 2/10, or we can write this as 1/5. And finally, beta sub 4, which was 0 over 10, well, that's just 0. So one way you can think of this is that for this particular weighted voting system, if you think of the power as being divided, all the power as being divided into 5 equal pieces, then player 1 controls 3 of those pieces, player 2 controls 1 piece, player 3 controls 1 piece, and player 4 controls no pieces. So player 2 and player 3 have the same amount of power, 1/5 of the total power. Player 1 has 3/5 of the total power, and player 4 has nothing at all. Now if we go back up and we look at our weighted voting system here, it's pretty clear that player 1 should somehow come out with more power, and it also is kind of clear that player 4, which has only 1 vote, might come out to have no power. But what's interesting is that player 2 and player 3, inside this weighted voting system, player 2 has actually twice as many votes as player 3, and yet they have exactly the same amount of power. So it's important in these weighted voting systems to understand that power is not a simple function of the numbers here. What matters is more kind of how the numbers relate to one another, which is exactly what this Bonds-off power index brings out.